So, following our March 1st shooting episode podcast, I got a message from a Canadian scholar, Brendan Wright, concerning some of the things that I may have glossed over slightly in my summarization of trying to come up with a shorthand of what they were protesting that day on March 1st, 1947. So I thought, why not invite him onto the podcast and get into a little bit more about the history of what or how 4/3 Jeju Massacre happened. So thank you for coming onto the podcast, Brendan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Nice to see you, Brendan. Thank you.
Yeah, nice to see you.
I should mention that Brendan's a lecturer at St. Mary's University, and he does research on anti-left massacres during the Korean War with a framing work of memory politics of these massacres. Is that a good way to summarize it?
Yeah, I would say mass violence and memory politics. Because, I kind of do a bit of both, yeah.
Oh, perfect. So I guess let's get at it and say, what are some of the factors that led to the March 1st shooting incident where 6 people were killed and 8 were injured that kind of went to the beginning of the massacre?
Yeah, right. So just to give I sort of brought it on myself to come onto this podcast by challenging some of what you claimed. So I just want to say, first of all, to yourself and your viewer, I actually really liked your discussion of it, and I actually learned some things I didn't know, which is not always the case, especially at the hospital. But to give people some background, I took a little umbrage with the idea that they were protesting the division of Korea. Now, I think some of it's tricky because there's the March 1st incident, then there's what's called the 4/3 uprisings. By the time of the 4/3 uprisings, the position was, or at least one of the official reasons was, opposing the separate elections in the South. And some of this was indeed, we could say, a kind of national resistance or a way to prevent the division of Korea. But the other side of the coin is that the unification elections were going to be a very bad thing for the local left. So some of this was to prevent the further erosion of their position in Jeju's politics. Now, about the March 1st uprisings, or the protests, it gets a little complicated because there's what the people of Jeju were protesting, and then there's how they were organized. And we don't know where one begins and where one ends. At least the primary groups who organized the protest and led the speeches were tied to the Jeju left and the Workers' Party and the People's Committees. And you can see from their speeches, they were demanding, among other things, the resurrection of the People's Committees because Jeju had lost a lot of its sovereignty with the integration of the province into the mainland. And with that was also a shift in political power to the right, who were more aligned with the central government, and a decline of the local left power. So that's the political context. But also in their speeches, they're asking, for example, for the withdrawal of the arrest warrant for Park Han-young, who was the leader of the South Korean Workers' Party. So quite clearly there is a kind of what we could see as a left-wing tone to these protests. Now, as far as the people in Jeju protesting, there was a lot of things happening. With that process, there was an increased tax burden on the population. There was a massive increase in police, including police from the mainland. There was loss of local autonomy from many village elders who were respected. So these things are not what we could consider to be properly ideological in left-right terms.
So like two different situations coming together to form one, basically.
Yeah, or part of a process that we can see from different angles, like one being, definitely political leaders fighting over control of things, but then, the society being engulfed in this. And there's an ideological context, and then there's an institutional context to it.
Yeah. And do you think that politics, do you think the Jeju people were being led a certain way?
It's hard for me to tell because we don't quite know what there is going on in their consciousness. The position of the Americans at the time, who were quite just chauvinistic and bigoted about this, was that the Jeju people were ignorant and didn't know better, and then were susceptible to the extreme right and the extreme left and didn't know what was good for them. But, I think a lot of it has to do with the actual structure. And this was true more so in Jeju, but true of a lot of Korea, where a lot of actually authority was in local village leaders like the Myeonjang or some of the thought leaders who were tied to these communities. So, we have to get into that level, and I haven't done a lot of research on what was going on at that level, but I don't think it's a layered structure, and I don't think it's the case where they're ideological, but they're not apolitical.
I got you.
It's interesting that you mentioned about the Americans, right? Because part of the reason why the left had such a strong hold on Jeju was because following liberation, the Workers' Party was essentially the de facto government on Jeju for like an entire year. So when they banned the party from functioning, they had already been the government. So my question is that the bigoted stance of the Americans is kind of why they didn't have a government on Jeju for an entire year beforehand? Is that something that allowed that to happen? The vacuum?
I don't think it's quite the bigoted sense. I think a lot of the vacuum just had to do with where it was in terms of its political geography and just its rank of importance. Like, it's an isolated island from the mainland. The way the Americans worked out in terms of how they overtook and dismantled the autonomous powers of the People's Committees or the kind of Korea People's Republic was they branched out in Seoul and then moved out into the areas, right? And then it's telling that, the big uprisings happened furthest away from the capital, first in and around Daegu in 46, and then in Jeju, because these periods had the longest period of People's Committees gestation and autonomy. So, it could be, I don't think it's the first priority was kind of like an act of bigotry towards Jeju. Right. It's just in terms of imperial geography, this is just not that important.
That's a good point. Americans didn't get here for a couple months anyways. Like before Jeju, it took them a while to get here, I believe.
Right, yeah. And they saw it as, looking at the documents, there's different ways of looking at it. Because one is, that iconic image where they're showing taking down the Japanese flag and putting up the American flag. So it's quite imperial. But then the other side of it, it's broadly a hands-off imperialism at the first time, at least from an administrative perspective, and the Americans just saw the People's Committee as kind of benign.
There's this piece of research that I've been sitting on, and I don't know what to do with it. Is the fact that when I found out that some of the Americans that were on Jeju, their families were here with them.
Oh, right? Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, you're probably more knowledgeable about the American context than I am, and I'd be interested to learn more about that. So they're where are they based in Jeju? In the city, or?
Yeah, well, Gwendokjeong, right? They had close to where the March 1st shooting incident happened, right? But it's like when you look at some of the files and some of the declassified transcripts and whatnot, there's a lot of corruption, but it's not this like corruption that you always necessarily think of, right? Like it's like cronyism and doing things for people that can do things for them on the island and this kind of stuff that angered
the American way.
Yeah, kind of, I suppose so. As a Canadian, maybe I shouldn't comment on that.
I can say that because I'm American.
But it's just in like my interest is always on the personal, the actual histories, because I get bogged down when we talk about Americanism, when we talk about the bigger political stuff, and I can actually hold on to the fact that, one of the daughters of one of the Americans learned to drive on Jeju, right? Like this is where she got her driving experience during the massacre, which is just floors me that kind of stuff happened. So, continuing on what we were talking about, one of the things that you did mention to me in the message is that Jeju is often overlooked for the nationalist credentials, like I said, concerning the division, and what I agree with that. But why do you think that is?
So what you mean? Why has kind of nationalism overtaken some of these more ideological and political elements in terms of the dominant representations?
Right. Well, why does it become like the nationalists push for like like fighting against the division of Korea become what it seems to overshadow the entire event, massacre now.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's a really complicated history, but to just think about some of the fast things. One is, of course, just the stigma of leftism. Many people were murdered as communists, but that didn't end, of course, after Jeju 4-3. There was the Yunjwaje, like the guilt by association system, where people were surveilled, denied entrance into government positions, denied visas. And these are just the overt. There's the whole psychological context to that. So there's to achieve any kind of recognition as victims, they have to negotiate with this stigma of leftism. Now. So I think that's why there's always this reluctance to kind of deal directly with the ideological context. Looking at it more locally, the other thing is like, this is tricky, right? Because there's elements to the Jeju 4-3, but one of them is partially a civil war with the people of Jeju amongst themselves. This is to ignore the element of the mainland rightist invasion, which I think is more foundational.
It's a big part,
right? Scale of violence, and I'm of the position that the state is responsible for the massacre. But there was also leftist violence against rightists and other just opportunistic or revenge killings. So I think when the process of reconciliation happened, it wasn't just about honor restitution of leftists. It's also in some ways about reconciling this history of civil war violence. So I think downplaying the ideological context and instead playing on victimhood is useful. At the same time, I think it's still a political story, right? So you can't just work with this kind of narrative of victims. There needs to be something else there. And there were concrete nationalist appeals to the left, right? It's not like these are mutually exclusive, and it's the same with the right wing as well. Like what's going on in Korea are competing nationalisms, among other things. So it's that's kind of a long explanation, but I think it's still like getting with it's a long and general explanation. So I think it's the stigma of leftism, but also still trying to recover this politicization. And one thing to think about with the name is I recently got a note from a scholar. It was actually in a review for an article I wrote, so I don't know who said this, but they actually told me that now the Samsa Sagon name is falling out of favor. And instead they mentioned that it's now back to, and I'll find the exact name there, but the English translation is the People's Protest in Korean Unification.
I have never heard that before.
Yeah, so this could have been from a left scholar who was saying this, but this is very similar to the 80s kind of Minjung movement, where it's the Hangjang struggle and the uprising, but they've added this Korean unification to the kind of struggle.
That's
so these things are still ongoing, and I would have to look into this because I saw this very recently that now there's a push.
I don't know if that's true, to be honest with you, because I talk to a lot of scholars and deal with their work here, and I've never seen it referred to that. But it's
I've seen it referred to that, but I don't know in any kind of official formal context.
No, this goes to like one of the lines that you wrote in one of your works is that there's a profound ambivalence as to how to properly define the event, right? And I spent a lot of my time talking to people before, trying to like going into the different political aspects of the different names and so forth. But why do you think, what do you mean, and why do you think there's been a profound ambivalence about properly defining it?
Yeah, I think it has to do again with the kind of political history of it, where first it was written off as this riot, and then
dismissive,
Yeah, and then after kind of a claim of the uprising narrative as pushback, and then now into this Sakon, which is just like, it's in some ways it's safer to be very ambivalent in your official explanations, and it's more inclusive, right? So
Yeah.
that's also, I think, very important for the local healing. And I think what's
The
gone on
recognition, yeah.
broadly. Yeah, and more broadly, I think what's going on, and this has always been the case, but through this, there's also just the production and reproduction of local identity. And this
Okay.
incident has been elevated, right? I'm sure you're aware of this living on Jeju. This is now part of I don't like this term. I don't love it, but I'm going to use it. Part of the imagined community of Jejuers, right, is shared history of suffering and grief and resistance.
This is true, yeah.
But I worry. I hear a lot about reconciliation when it comes to this event, right? And it sometimes feels like what they mean by reconciliation, and I think it's Tallahassee Coates who says that the term reconciliation often means with the concretization of history, right? And it kind of feels like they're, the best way to say it is that when somebody talked about nominating the island of Jeju for the Nobel Peace Prize, they keep saying that they got over the event. It's over with. They reconciled. But it's not the case when you talk to survivors, right? In some ways, like they talk about, yeah, I can point to the houses where families of murderers still live, right? Like and so I think that ambivalence is a good way to put it, because it's such a fraught and political minefield of a situation, right?
There's so much information.
Right. And I think now there's because of just the timing, it is now almost officially moving into kind of post-memory where there are very few witnesses or survivors.
Yeah.
So, I don't think these calls for the history being closed really will come into fruition just because of the way any traumatic history ends. So I think you're right to be kind of wary of that, but I also think they'll, just because of the enormity of it and what we don't know, I think there'll continue to be contestations about it at all kinds of levels. But when we're thinking about some of the work I do, which principally looks at at least the stuff you've looked at is more state sanctioned, or at least stuff that runs through the state and is supposed to be official, then there's a bit more of an effort to make it concrete and official, right, and try to find a consensus. So some of this is also just part of the bureaucratization of history that we see happen every that word, but you know what I mean. Like,
yeah,
you have multiple competing actors here, and there has to be some kind of consensus or frame. I actually think it's quite it's not my place to say what I like or don't like, but I do think the idea of the Sakon as open-ended and unknown and ambivalent, I think is actually appropriate at that level.
Right. And so one of the things that you have written about is you talk about it being a part of a larger and broader campaign of violent political cleansing. What other aspects? So you kind of put it in a larger context. What other? Can you explain a little bit about these connections to other atrocities that you're referring to?
Yeah, right. And I'll try to do it without reciting my whole dissertation. It's really challenging.
Good luck.
Right. So we talked a little bit about the political history of left-right struggle, and just to frame Jeju a little, the way I see it is I actually see it very much as less of an uprising, like the uprising's there, but I think actually the dominant engine driving this is the right-wing consolidation and takeover of the state, which is happening both in Jeju and at the national level through the establishment of separate elections, and the American help. So in the case of Jeju, the government in some ways saw this as a test to their legitimacy and authority, both as a state but also as a Cold War state, as part of the American bulwark. And there's this effort to make an example of Jeju, almost as a kind of sacrifice to show the Americans how good they are at preventing communists and massacring them.
Interesting.
But in terms of these other massacres, well, of course, while this is going on, the Yasun uprisings happen in the south, and many of the same counterinsurgency methods that are used on Jeju get imported onto the mainland. and a lot of the legal structures that are in place for creating boundaries of citizen and non-citizen, giving paramilitary groups the powers of summary execution. All these things get embedded into the state through this process of civil war and mass violence. And then when the North invade, then there's a broader effort or a project, I guess, of wiping out all the leftists. So I see it as a continuum, in other words, of state construction and ideological consolidation, and also a kind of counterinsurgency that in some ways is also creating the boundaries of who is and isn't a citizen of the South Korean state. Right, through this process of civil war violence. So I see these events as all interconnected. I hope I didn't lose you or anyone with that.
No.
Yeah, so right.
It's really interesting to think of it that way, right? Like I'm trying to when I start thinking of it in a larger context, like it's not just because the way that we hear about it, it's so singular. Right, like it's separate. Yeah. It's its own thing, and it doesn't really connect to anything else, really, any of the other histories.
Yeah,
right?
I think so when I've spoken to activists about this, and you can see this at the museum, some of this stuff is adjacent to it. Like there's a separate little section on Yasun, and there's a certain sense of shared solidarity and suffering, but it's kind of ephemeral in some ways, or at least as a side just for supplementing the idea of the localized atrocity. And I think in terms of collective memory or things, this stuff it makes sense. So when I critique it or put it into this broader frame, there's no real claim at my end about what should or shouldn't be done in the realm of memory. Now, of course, one of the interesting things about Jeju, and this is great, is it has a lot of research institutes and information and documentation, and it's somewhat asymmetric in relationship to what's happened on the mainland, where the restitution and truth process has been a lot more curtailed. So at this point now, it's kind of like the Jeju 4-3 has sort of superseded it even at the national level for the kind of anti-leftist violence.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't really know that.
In the counterinsurgency. I mean, that's a general claim, right? But some of this comes down to the local aspect as well. So, for example, the National Guidance League killings. I don't love doing the numbers game, but there are credible work and evidence to suggest that the National Guidance League killings dwarfed the Jeju killings in terms of numbers. Like Kim Dong-chun, for example, has said it could be at least 100,000. And I've looked at the numbers, and it just seems to have happened on a massive scale across all of South Korea. But it's not seen as a local event or a provincial event because it just happens at the village level, and almost every village or every county basically south of Seoul is touched by this event where leftists got wiped out over 3 months. But that doesn't have the same kind of purchase in national or local memory, I think, for local reasons, and also because in the case of the National Guidance League killings, for those who are unfamiliar, these are officially confessed leftists. That history is complicated in itself, but yeah, so...
That's fascinating. I'm not familiar with that very much.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know. Interesting. No. Tangents, but yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around the kind of broader anti-left killings and what is and isn't local.
It's I did like reading your work for that and starting to think of it in that larger context, which in Korea, and it makes it kind of interesting when Korea actually spends quite a bit of time trying to connect it with other atrocities. Like you've been to the park, they have the Berlin Wall there. They have they compare it to genocides, and some people argue that it is a genocide, right? So it's interesting that they go out of their way to it's not a judgment or anything, but there is an attempt to try to connect it internationally as opposed to locally. is that more just a way to try to get under, like,
Attention?
to get the word out, get like to
Mhm.
Jeju's trying to globalize it in a lot of ways, like they're trying
Yeah, I
to get
think
people to know it.
I think that's part of it, right? And you can
Mm.
think about the audience, and I can't, from these texts, I can't necessarily read into what the intentionality is all the time. But I definitely think this general issue of the problem of leftism in the memory of the Korean Civil War is unresolved,
Hmm.
and is still fraught. So this, you know, now I won't say this in the case of the people of Jeju or the readers, but when I've done some of my work, traveling to different massacre sites, talking to some of the Yujokwe or the Bri family associations, and it changes from group to group. But a common thing that I'll come across is this idea that the wrong people were massacred or the wrong people were repressed,
Mm.
and no, very few people who were killed as leftists in the memory were actually leftists. And that's probably true in a lot of cases, but there's still this huge stigma about that political history,
Hmm.
which I entirely understand from a perspective of people who have been repressed and stigmatized and basically gaslit
Mhm.
about this history for so long. But in terms of the problem of national memory, and this goes back to the issue of the People's Committees and the People's Republic, one of the great what ifs of post liberation Korea is part of this politicide and this massacre. I think this point's very important, was the wiping out of a different idea of Korea. That had potentially, in some ways, not just left, but also more autonomous government. Things like early land reforms, all these ideas that were progressive got annihilated in this period.
Hmm.
Just shut down completely, hey?
Yeah, well, in a complex way, right? But the
Right.
kind of straw on that was, the massacre of the leftists, and in
Okay.
the North, it's a different history.
Okay.
So your work focuses on, and tell me if I'm wrong, on like the politics of memory. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And can you explain a little bit what that means? Because I'm not sure if a lot of people understand what politics of memory. Is that a huge?
I definitely. Hit me,
No,
Brandon.
it's
Hit me with
funny. It's
some
funny
information.
because sorry. It's just interesting because I've been in the process right now. I'm still advertised myself as a politics of memory scholar, but some
Mm.
people have said actually looking at my work, it's not really about memory because it's a continued political development. Because I look into the '60s, but I mean to answer your question, politics of memory are just kind of contestations about how an event in the past is remembered or forgotten, and who has the power or right to make purchase on that.
Mm.
uh, yeah, so looking at, in this case, in our case, like how at least first the anti-communist right got to dominate the memory, and then now there's been pushback.
Mm.
So that's what I refer to as the politics of memory, just trying to deal with this traumatic past.
It
And
seems
that's
like
what you.
important work, like just based on what you're saying. Obviously, you two are much more educated on the subject, but just that phrase right there, politics of memory, seems like an important thing to define to really understand what all happened. Because if you don't understand this piece, because a lot of information you're telling me is new, so if you don't understand this piece, you're not going to understand the full package, the full
Yeah, right.
I don't know the right word to say there, but yeah.
Yeah, and I should just say quickly, when I set out to do this work in the late 2000, the aughts, I guess we call them, I was going to be looking at contested memory, period. And then as I got into my research, more and more of it actually became about this unacknowledged history of organized and systemic mass violence, and this kind of untold story of a broad campaign to wipe out groups. So yeah, you have to dig into the concrete history of that to understand how the politics play out after.
It's interesting. How did you get into becoming a Korean scholar?
Yeah, I refer to myself as an accidental Koreanist. I kind of stumbled into it. In my MA, I was doing the Vietnam War, and I just started to see a lot of references to Korea there, and I became interested in the production of the past, and at the time, an interest. I was a Cold War scholar, an international relations scholar, and I got very frustrated with reading texts where, like, there was a short paragraph that said, 100,000 people were killed and just nothing else. And I was like, whoa, I started to really hit on me just how violent this period of world history was and how little was discussed. And at this time, I became aware of the Korean War. I became aware of what was going on with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Korea. And originally, I was going to look at U.S. massacres like Nogonni, which you're probably familiar with, or some of the bombings of South Korean citizens that happened. But then as things progressed, I became more interested in this story.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And so that's why you like to write about the 1960-61 period, because that has a lot to do with memory of trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah, in the 60-61 period, I think there has been so few analyses of that period and what the bereaved families did. And just to give yourselves and the readers, or not the readers, the viewers or listeners, can tell I'm a writer.
Yeah.
A sense of what happened, of course, after the 419, protests or revolution, whatever you want to call it. There was, in that period of the Second Republic, actually petitions from bereaved families to have investigations and the right to mourn their loved ones over these massacres. This happened in Jeju, but it also happened in Gyeongsang and Cholla. And I'm somewhat familiar with the story of Gyeongsang and Cholla. And
Brendan, can I ask you a question real quick? When you say you're saying publicly mourn, the right to publicly acknowledge, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, and even the right, I should say, even in some cases, the right to privately mourn, because the state actually prevented access from the victims to the bodies. Some of these bodies have been desecrated by being burned, but weren't allowed to even access the graves, and the whole complicated nature of mourning in Korea. And when I did my research, I actually found that the main issue for families was that they were being haunted by their loved ones, because of this idea of kind of a begrudged spirit. So there was also a very visceral, intimate reason for this, to get rights to perform proper mortuary services. And I think the public aspect also was a political act, I think, to challenge what the state had said about this history, right? And 60-61, I think, is interesting because this is still all the survivors, and this history is still quite wrong. And the big question mark for me is what happens in the village level after the massacres, and between this 60-61 period. We still don't quite know a lot about it during these, decade or so. But the Park junta, when they overthrew the Second Republic, ordered the mass arrest of much of the bereaved family associations, jailed them, tortured some of their leaders, but also, I think, most grimly destroyed the monuments to the victims, in some ways desecrated their graves. So you can see a continuation. Is this politicidal logic where it's kind of right down to the level of the graves.
It didn't end just with the kill. It just was on and on.
Right. Yeah. Precisely. That's what happened in 60-61 very briefly.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm only familiar with that a little bit because of Kim Hun-jun, who wrote The Massacres at Mount Hala. He's done a lot of work about the the reconciliation committees and things like that. I think that's his interest. And I remember he referred to the 60-61, this very short, 1 year period where there was democracy, no dictator before Park came into play, as a mad dash to, they started on Jeju at least. They started an investigation into the massacre, right? Yeah. So, and that was put to stop the second Park went into power.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Interesting.
And yeah, there's different ways too in the politics of memory about how to see that event. And again, the conflicts over leftism in that national memory are very complicated because the National Bereaved Family Association was led by ex-members of the Bodo Youngmang, who had been members of the Namnodong, the South Korean Workers' Party, and that was the justification for their repression, was that they were leftist. So in a lot of the I think this is true of Dr. Kim's work as well, but a lot of the studies I've found is kind of like they were just looking for the truth about what's happened, but it's actually there's the politics of that era are very complicated, and I've seen a lot of kind of leftist critiques of the state start to reemerge in the 60s. Jeju's a bit different, though. I see a stronger push on this reconciliation being tied to the promises of the 419 revolution and democratization, and the membership involved in there were, I think, less tied to anything that could be considered leftist politics.
Okay, great. I think that's about all the time we have. We've gone over. That was really interesting.
So
yeah,
much.
sorry, I ramble and go on, but
no need to apologize. I wanted to hear
please.
it. Yeah, I let it. It was fascinating. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on, and we'll have you on again if you're willing to join us at another time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me too.